the first question we always want to ask ourselves is, well, what part of me is benefiting from the addiction? What part of me is actually getting its needs met? What is the unmet need that the addiction is actually fulfilling? What part of me is benefiting by sabotaging, right? What am I afraid would happen if I let go of this addiction? What am I afraid would happen if I didn't sabotage myself in this way? And if you actually look at the benefits rather than just looking at the negatives, you actually start to peel back the layers of the unmet need that the addiction or the pattern of self sabotage is actually fulfilling. Hi, this is Greg Schmaus. Welcome back to the podcast. In today's episode, we're diving into all things addiction, healing addiction, understanding the root cause of addiction, and understanding what an addiction truly is. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart because it's something that I've worked through in my own life and something that I work with regularly in my one-on-one coaching practice. So to begin, we want to explore what is an addiction. And I'll give you a few definitions, both that I've heard from experts and teachers that I enjoy, and some that I've really explored within my own self. So, an addiction is really someone or something that you give your power away to, right? If we're addicted to alcohol, we're giving our power, our freedom, our sovereignty away to this substance. If we're addicted to a person, we're giving our power away to them, right? So, an addiction is something that we're giving our power away to, something that we're giving our freedom and sovereignty away to. And addiction is also someone or something that we feel dependent on, right? If we're giving our freedom away to something, we don't feel independent of that thing. We create a codependent relationship. So codependency is one of the most common patterns that we see in relationship to addiction. So an addiction is something that we give our power away to, our sovereignty, our freedom, and something that we feel dependent on or create a codependent relationship with. An addiction is any repeated behavior that creates pain or does not create the result that we're really looking for, right? But for some reason, we keep going back to that thing or keep going back to that person. And unfortunately, there's some need getting met, but it's also creating a lot of pain and there's patterns of self sabotage. So we keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. And unfortunately, it's not giving us the results that we're looking for, or maybe fortunately. Also, an addiction is something that almost works, right? This is one of my favorite definitions from Peter Crone. Peter Crone says an addiction is something that we do that it gets us so close to what we're looking for, but it doesn't quite get us there. It never will. So an addiction is something that almost works, right? So these are a couple of definitions of an addiction that I've really enjoyed. And we're going to dive into some of the root causes of addiction. But to start, also, I want to point out that nowadays in our modern consumerist-based culture, 99% of people are struggling with an addiction and not even knowing it, right? How many people struggle with caffeine addiction, right? Another definition of an addiction is something that is a want, but becomes a need, right? So a lot of times we have wants. I want a cup of coffee. I want a drink. I want to watch television. I would like some cake. But when that turns into, I need a drink, I need a cup of coffee, I need to watch television, I need a piece of cake, that's where we create addiction. So another definition of addiction, I'm backtracking a little bit, is an addiction is when a want becomes a need. And a want becomes a need usually when there are unmet needs, right? And we'll dive into a little bit of that together. But circling back to 99% of people struggling with addiction nowadays, caffeine addiction, I need a cup of coffee. Cell phone addiction, I need to check my email, my text messages, my Instagram account. Entertainment addiction, I need to watch television at night to go to sleep. Food addiction, I need the sugar, I need the Diet Coke, whatever it might be, processed foods. So 99% of people are actually struggling with, we could say, socially approved addictions without even knowing it. And unfortunately, our consumerist-based culture, our dopamine-driven culture, is really feeding right into the socially approved addictions that we're actually unconscious of. So really, this podcast episode is applicable to not just people who have quote unquote substance abuse issues, alcoholic, drug abuse, but anyone who finds themselves in relationship with something that's not a true need, that is a want, but they're in relationship with that thing as if it is a need. So if you find yourself saying, I need a cup of coffee, I need a piece of cake. I need to check my phone. I need this. I need that. Ask yourself, is this really a need or is this a want? And why is this want becoming a need? Something that we'll dive further into. So, what are the root causes of addiction? I'm a big fan of Gabor Mate's work where he says all addiction is rooted in trauma. And now, for this to be the case, it's important for us to identify and define what is trauma. Trauma is not necessarily what happens to you, trauma is the story or narrative you created about what happened to you. It's the way that you perceived what happened to you. So, trauma is not necessarily just reserved for sexual abuse, being in a car accident, your house being robbed, being kidnapped, the death of a parent, the death of a sibling. Those things are traumatic. Physical abuse, emotional abuse, those things, yes, are traumatic. But trauma is really anything that you experience that you have a hard time integrating the experience of in the nervous system, and some part of you fragments off in that experience and stays stuck in that stress response. So when we experience trauma, and it doesn't have to be one of these big traumas that we're talking about, like being sexually abused, being in an accident, experiencing, the death of somebody or some sort of loss. A trauma can really be any experience that we have a hard time integrating, processing, and moving forward in our wholeness because some part of us fragments off in that experience, gets frozen in time, and is then essentially looking at the present through the lens of that past experience. So once again, trauma is not what happened to you, it's what you perceived happening in that situation and how well or poorly you were able to process or integrate the experience, what sort of stress response your nervous system went into, and if any part of your psyche fragments off in that experience, gets frozen in time, and moving forward is now perceiving the present through the lens of the past. So an example of this would be when I was growing up, I was playing competitive golf. I would travel around the country playing golf tournaments. Sometimes my mother would take me, sometimes my father would take me. When my mother would take me, she would walk all 18 holes. When my father would take me, he would walk the course and follow along. But I noticed there was many times in which I stopped playing well. So anytime I started playing poorly, what I would notice is my dad would leave and he would wait in the clubhouse when I finished. Now at the time, there was a part of me that perceived that as, oh, when I don't perform, my father abandons me. When I don't perform at my best, when I don't play well, my father abandons me, right? That was the perception that I was experiencing, the way I was perceiving the event when I was 13, 14, 15, 16 years old, whatever it was. Now, years later, I asked my father, hey, when I stopped playing well and you would go wait in the clubhouse, I'm just curious what your reasoning, thinking, or intention was. And what he said was, well, I figured if you weren't playing well, you probably wouldn't want me there. So I was trying to give you the space to work through whatever you were going through on the course. And I figured I would just wait in the clubhouse for when you were finished. And if you were playing well, then I would stay there with you because I figured you would want to be witnessed when you were playing your best. So he was actually doing what he thought I empathically wanted or needed, but I perceived it in a very different way. I perceived it as an abandonment, as a rejection. And you could see how something like that might be traumatic for a child and then might create some sort of compensation pattern, such as perfectionism or being a workaholic or having some sort of addiction to medicate anytime that he feels less than, that his performance is subpar, so to speak. So this is an example where a trauma has nothing to do with what happened. It had to do with how you perceived it, how you integrated it, and now how you adapt to it, right? You adapt to it as, I'm now a perfectionist, I'm now a people pleaser, I now abandon myself, reject myself, I now develop an inner critic when I'm not performing at an optimal level, etc., etc. So you could see how the adaptation to the trauma is really where the trauma continues to live in your system. And this opens the door wide open for addiction, right? So before we move forward, trauma is not what happened, it's how you perceived it, how you were able to or not able to integrate it, and how you then had to adapt to the trauma, what part of you fragmented off, now perceiving the present through the lens of the past, and the adaptation opens the door wide open for an addiction. In addition, in addition, all addictions are when the head and the heart are out of alignment, right? The head represents your rational, cognitive, logical thinking. Your heart represents your feeling and intuitive based perception, right? So your head represents the masculine part of you. The heart represents the feminine part of you. When your head and heart are out of alignment, out of coherence, not in congruence, it's kind of like your head, the masculine, is like your father. The heart, the feminine, is like your mother. And it's kind of like you're the child where dad is saying one thing, your mom is saying another thing, and there's confusion and the ability to make a clear choice is disrupted, right? So the alignment of the head and the heart is crucial when it comes to healing addiction, right? The head is your thinking process, your heart is your feeling process, and the choice that you make is the action, right? When we have addictions, we're either thinking and then acting without feeling, or we're feeling and then acting without thinking, where the healing process is the alignment of thinking, feeling, and acting, right? So thinking and acting could be overriding what you're feeling in your body, what you're feeling in your heart, what you're feeling intuitively, what you're feeling emotionally, right? So an addiction of like that could be an addiction to exercise, right? Someone who has an addiction to exercise might be really tired one day in their body, really sore in their body, or maybe they're struggling with their digestion. So their body is not feeling great. So the body is saying, take a day off. But the mind is saying, well, you have to work out because this is your exercise program and you have to work out 7 days a week. So you lose 20 pounds. So you look good in a bathing suit because you're overweight, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you're driven by the mental thinking process, overriding what you're feeling in the body and making a choice based on that, right? So misalignment in the head and the heart. In contrast, sometimes we might feel and act without thinking. This could be us acting impulsively because something feels good in the body or feels good in the heart. But if we check in with our thinking mind where our values might reside, we might notice that it's not in alignment with our values. So for example, let's say you're in a monogamous relationship and you're walking in the grocery store or you're at the mall or you're at an event and you see someone that you find extremely attractive and you notice every cell in your body is just lit up and your heart is opened and all of a sudden you find yourself in bed with that person or doing something that goes against your values of being in a monogamous relationship at that given moment, right? So if you're operating from just feeling and acting without thinking, we might act impulsively and do something that's out of alignment with our values, right? We've all made that choice where all of a sudden we're like, what in the world did I just do? Why did I do that? I wasn't even thinking, right? So feeling and acting is more the impulsivity that can happen if we're not connected to our values and our own conscious awareness, right? So the alignment of the head and the heart before making choice and taking action, that alignment is essential for healing addiction because we open the door for addiction when the head and the heart are out of alignment. And when we're thinking and acting without feeling and acting impulsively without thinking, and not thinking, feeling, and acting all in alignment, right? So alignment of head and heart is another important piece of the puzzle when it comes to healing addiction. Another piece is called the story gap. This was introduced to me by my teacher and mentor, Paul Chek. So the story gap represents the gap or the difference between your inner story and your outer story, right? So your inner story might be, I'm not feeling well, I'm struggling in a relationship, I don't like my work, or I'm having this sort of challenge. But your outer story that you present to the world is, oh, I'm fine, everything's great, look at me, everything's hunky-dory. Well, you create what's called this story gap where the inner experience and the outer experience are not matching, right? So you're dividing or fragmenting yourself in half where you're now living two stories. One thing that does is that creates a lot of fatigue because now you have to divide your energy into two different personas. It creates the opportunity for addiction and dis-ease, because as we're dividing our energy, we're depleting ourselves, and we have to kind of micromanage two realities, right? So there's a lack of alignment and there's a lack of truth when we're living too much of a story gap. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to reveal everything and anything to any person walking down the street, but it is important that our stories are aligned in our inner experience and our outer experience. And the wider the gap or the difference between the inner and the outer story or narrative, the more we open the door for fatigue, addiction, illness, and dis-ease. So the story gap is really essential. And one thing you notice with the classic addict archetype is there's a lack of honesty and truth, right? So the addict archetype can be quite a shapeshifter or manipulator. So this story gap is really common with the addict archetype. In addition, all addictions are an attempt at creating a safe container, safe connection, or safe attachment to something or someone, right? So, for example, as Paul Chek says, a bottle of alcohol is never going to say no to you. A pack of smokes is never going to judge you, right? Whatever your source of addiction is, it actually feels like a safe thing to connect to, a safe thing to attach to, or a safe container for you to put yourself or some aspect of yourself within, right? Metaphorically, a bottle of alcohol is literally a container. A bottle is a container that contains some aspect of us, right? So anytime we feel unsafe, disconnected, or insecure in our attachments to others, a lot of times we use an addiction as a replacement. So this is why understanding the science and nature of attachment styles is really important for healing addiction, because a lot of times when we're struggling with an addiction, there's usually some element of an insecure attachment in our past that's still carrying over into our present. And the addiction, whether it's alcohol, entertainment, exercise, some sort of drug or substance, it's a replacement for that insecure attachment, finding some level of safe connection, right? So what we want to ask ourselves is, where over the course of my life did I not feel a safe sense of connection, a insecure attachment, or where did I not have a safe container for me to process my experience, my emotions, my thoughts, whatever my experience was? And how can I learn how to show up for myself in that way? Because a lot of times the addiction is actually where we create the connection, attachment, or container for the parts of us that we haven't learned how to connect with internally. So we outsource it or project it into something else, right? So understanding the attachment styles is really essential. Also, the addict archetype is the archetype of extremes, right? So the addict archetype is always in this all or nothing mentality. The addict archetype has a hard time with balance. The addict archetype is always going from one extreme to another, all or nothing, extreme diets and then binging, working out 7 days a week and then not working out for months at a time, working, 24 hours a day and then just throwing the towel and sabotaging yourself, right? The addict archetype is always working in these patterns of extremes and has a hard time with balance. It has a hard time with what the Buddhists call the middle way. So a lot of healing addiction is healing the patterns of extremes that exist in your own life, the all or nothing mentality. A lot of people struggle with eating disorders, the binging and the purging, the over exercising and then the not training, the going on extreme diets and then just, all hell breaks loose and you're just eating anything and everything, right? Having a hard time just having one drink. For some reason, as soon as you start drinking, you see the bottom of the bottle all of a sudden, right? So the addict archetype is always living in extremes. So we want to take a look at is, where do I have a hard time with balance? Where do I have a hard time with the middle way? And where am I bouncing back and forth between these extreme polarities, having a hard time finding the center point, right? So that's another element of addiction, is living in patterns of extremes. Another piece that is really related to our modern day, highly overstimulated, consumerist based culture is our relationship with dopamine, right? So dopamine is that reward center in the brain, that reward chemical neurochemical experience that we have when we achieve something, right? So ancestrally, historically, and you could say biologically, dopamine was designed for us to have the rewarding experience after we've accomplished something challenging or found something of value, right? So we went foraging and we found food. We went on the hunt and we got the kill. We had to build something, overcome something, and we completed the task and we got to the other side. The dopamine experience is the experience of the reward for going through that challenging process. Now, unfortunately, we can have the same neurochemical experience of dopamine and reward in a matter of seconds by just opening your pantry, opening your fridge, taking out your cell phone, and having the highly palliative sugary foods, the highly stimulating technology, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, the social media, how many likes I got on my post. We can get a dopamine hit in a matter of seconds without having to go through the challenging process to arrive at that experience of reward. So we're all looking for that dopamine experience of reward, but unfortunately, we no longer have to go through the challenging process to get there. So there's a part of us that, humans are lazy, right? The humans work on what's called the minimal electrical neuromuscular stimulation theory, which is you're going to put out as little energy as possible, right? The human system is always looking to conserve energy, not waste energy. So in the human body, the human nervous system, we're always looking to conserve energy. So if the body or nervous system doesn't have to spend energy somewhere, it's not going to. So unless we consciously make a choice. So when it comes to dopamine, it's very easy and seductive for us to get to that neurochemical experience of reward by just doing the thing that gets us there in a matter of seconds without having to go through the challenging process of getting there, whether it's doing a hard puzzle, getting a hard workout, and completing a project, doing something challenging. So the dopamine-driven culture that we're in is really one of the, root causes of addiction nowadays, right? Another piece of it is the overstimulated nervous system. Anytime that our autonomic nervous system is out of balance, under stress, and in a fight or flight response, it always moves us into survival mode. And anytime we move into survival mode, we move into the part of the brain called the default mode network. The default mode network is the part of us that says, do what you've always done, think what you've always thought, because that's kept you alive until now. Doing anything new, novel, different, or creative is a threat to your survival. So that's why we always go back to the old survival programs anytime we're in a stress response. And it's important to remember that stress accumulates and summates in the body. Your body and nervous system do not compartmentalize stress. So financial stress, relationship stress, nutritional stress, stress from any number of sources, environmental stress, your body doesn't differentiate that from running from a tiger or a lion that's chasing you out in nature when we were hunters and gatherers. So the truth is, as the stress summates in the body and nervous system, we immediately move into survival mode as if that lion or tiger is chasing us. We revert back into that default mode network, and we make the same survival-based choices that we've always made, which often includes eating all the food that's available, drinking all the liquid, whether it's water, alcohol, whatever it is that's available, doing the things that ensure our survival. But remember, surviving does not necessarily mean thriving. And a lot of times the choices that we make out of survival actually go against what would support us in thriving. And unfortunately, we're around all these different substances, foods, sugar, fast food. We have so much available to us at any given moment in most of the world. And as soon as we shift back into survival mode, which could be from any number of stressors, we don't realize that, hey, there is no famine. I am actually safe. I just had an argument with my spouse, or I'm just having some financial stress, but my survival is not really threatened right now. So I don't need to make a choice that is based in survival and end up seeing the bottom of the potato chip bag, because my nervous system, that's still very primal, does not know where the next meal might be coming from, and it might think that there's a famine taking place. Right? So anytime we create a stress response, we always go back to that default mode network, that survival program that says, do what you've always done, think what you've always thought, because that's kept you alive until now. So emptying that stress bucket is one of the most essential components to healing addiction, because balancing the nervous system is the prerequisite to making a new choice. We can't make new choices until we've rebalanced the nervous system, because that drive to constantly go back to our survival programs when we're under stress is too strong, right? So this is why healing the nervous system is the essential prerequisite to healing addiction. And lastly, I'm a big fan of internal family systems work, where we talk about in IFS work parts and protectors, right? We have all these different parts of our psyche that are all in relationship with one another. They're similar to archetypes. And one of the parts that we have are called protector parts. And protector parts are there to protect the wounded parts called exiles that we experience some sort of pain, some sort of wound, some sort of trauma, some sort of disconnection when we were younger in the past. Those are the parts of us that fragmented off in the time of the trauma and are still frozen in time in that past experience. We recruit a protector to protect that wounded part to make sure that in the present we never re-experience what happened in the past, right? So I gave my example on the golf course, which I was perceiving abandonment, and I recruit a protector that might be a perfectionist, that might be a workaholic, might be an inner critic, or some sort of pattern of addiction to protect the wounded part of me that experienced the perceived abandonment, right? So the work of IFS is to identify the protector parts, which then helps you identify where the pattern of addiction, pattern of self-sabotage, perfectionism, where that's actually coming from, seeing how it's actually trying to work for you, but it's trying to work for a past part of you, not the part of you that's living in the present, right? So a lot of these protector parts are working for exiles or wounded parts that got frozen in past experiences that we now need to bring back into the present moment so we can live in the present moment rather than looking at the present through the lens of the past and experiencing the present as if we're still re-experiencing or trying to avoid that past trauma, which the protector part actually still thinks that we're in, right? So in shamanism, this is called soul retrieval, right? Retrieving a soul fragment that got fragmented off in the experience of trauma. In IFS, these are called exiles, and the protector parts are the ones that are there to protect and preserve the wound and make sure that it never happens again. So if you struggle with addiction, I'm a big fan of looking into internal family systems IFS work, and you can find many practitioners. I do a lot of that work in my own one-on-one coaching practice, and it's phenomenal work to working with the psyche and working somatically to heal some of these parts and see where the patterns of addiction were really coming from. So when it comes to healing addiction, a lot of times when we identify the addiction, we're usually looking at the negatives, right? We're always looking at why the addiction is bad or wrong or negative in some way, which, yes, addictions aren't great for us. And it's important to identify how it's not serving us. But it's also important to identify what part of you is benefiting from the addiction. Because if we didn't have any part of us that was benefiting from it, the truth is we wouldn't do it, we wouldn't have it. So when it comes to the saboteur, the patterns of self-sabotage, which addiction ties into patterns of self-sabotage, the first question we always want to ask ourselves is, well, what part of me is benefiting from the addiction? What part of me is actually getting its needs met? What is the unmet need that the addiction is actually fulfilling? What part of me is benefiting by sabotaging, right? What am I afraid would happen if I let go of this addiction? What am I afraid would happen if I didn't sabotage myself in this way? And if you actually look at the benefits, rather than just looking at the negatives, you actually start to peel back the layers of the unmet need that the addiction or the pattern of self-sabotage is actually fulfilling. So my invitation to you is, if you're struggling with an addiction, ask yourself, what part of me is benefiting from it? What is the unmet need? What am I afraid would happen if I let go of this addiction? And this is where we arrive at what we started with, which is an addiction is when a want becomes a need, right? So what you can do as an integration process from this episode is make two columns. write a list of all of your wants, write a list of, write a list of all of your needs, right? So your needs could be healthy food, clean water, shelter, um, movement, love in your life, healthy relationships, right? So write down what are all of the needs, time for play and creativity, a sense of purpose and mission in life, sense of safety and security. What are all of my needs? Write those down. Then write down all of your wants. I want a drink once in a while. I want some entertainment. I want some dessert once in a while. I want, to have some good sex once in a while. I want to smoke some pot once in a while. Write down what your wants are. I want some coffee because I enjoy, a good espresso. I like to vaporize some tobacco once in a while. And then ask yourself, are there any wants in my life that have become needs or have a tendency to become needs? And if so, identify which one it is. And then once you do, then go through your list of needs and ask yourself, what need do I have that is unmet? Right? Wants become needs when there's a need that's going unmet. It could be the need for safety. Maybe we don't feel safe in some aspect of our life. It could be the need for loving relationships. Maybe we don't feel a sense of love and connection. It could be the need for authentic communication. Maybe we don't feel safe in certain relationships communicating authentically or honestly. Maybe it's the need for play, creativity, passion, or purpose, where we feel like we're just, doing what we think everyone else wants us to do, or living according to our parents' model of reality, someone else's dreams, or someone else's expectations, right? So if you really identify your wants and your needs, identify what want has become a need, and then identify what need is going unmet, you've chances are arrived at one of the possible potential root causes of your addiction, right? So this is a great integration process or assignment to do some inner work in conjunction with all the information from this podcast that I shared with you. I'm a big fan of after you listen to a podcast to take some time to integrate the information, write things down, do some inner exploration. So you're not just consuming one podcast, then jumping to the next one and the next one and the next one, which is now just an information addiction, which I know I've struggled with in my own life. So I'm very conscious and aware of it. So just in summary, all addictions are patterns of giving your power away to something, feeling dependent on something, losing your sense of freedom and sovereignty in relationship to that something, any repeated patterns that create more pain or do not create the results that you want. All addictions are patterns that almost work, and all addictions are when wants become needs, right? The root causes of addiction, trauma being the first, not what happened to you, but how you perceived it, the story or narrative you created around it, and how you were able to or not able to integrate and assimilate the experience, and what patterns of adaptation there were, whether it's patterns of perfectionism, people pleasing, patterns of addiction, workaholic, an inner critic, et cetera, et cetera. The internal family systems work is great for working with some of those patterns. All addictions are when the head and heart are out of alignment, right? Thinking, feeling, and acting are not in a state of alignment or congruence. We talked about the story gap, the difference between the inner and the outer story. The wider the gap, the more you open the door for fatigue, addiction, illness, and dis-ease. All addictions are safe containers, a sense of safe connection or safe attachment when we don't feel a sense of safe connection, attachment, or a safe container in some other area of our life. The addict archetype are the patterns of extremes. So healing addiction is a lot about balancing extremes. Then we talked about the dopamine addiction, our dopamine-driven society, the importance of letting go of the cheap sources of dopamine in replacement for giving yourself an opportunity to get to the reward experience after completing a hard task or going through some sort of challenge, a hard workout, a cold plunge, a sauna, completing a project, a puzzle, whatever it might be. Then a lot of addictions are really born out of the imbalance in the autonomic nervous system, where we're stuck in that fight or flight response. We move into survival mode, the default mode network of the brain, and all of a sudden we're doing what we've always done. We're thinking the way we've always thought. we're moving into survival mode, and any new, novel, creative, or different choice is really challenging until we rebalance the nervous system. So addictions can simply be an adaptation to stress. Now, instead of just looking at the negatives of addiction, look at the benefits. How am I benefiting from this? What need is getting met? What am I afraid would happen if I let go of this addiction? How am I benefiting from these patterns of self sabotage? What would happen to me if I didn't have this addiction? It would open you up to something. Now, the truth is, it would open you up to freedom. But unfortunately, the saboteur in us likes to sabotage freedom in exchange for safety, right? So a lot of it is our relationship between safety and freedom. The saboteur always reverts back to safety, often at the expense of our freedom. And obviously, an addiction is something that we give our freedom away to. So as an integration process, write down all of your needs, write down all of your wants, and explore any wants that have become needs. Go through your list of needs. What is the unmet need? Chances are you may have arrived at one of the root challenges related to your patterns of addiction. And if you'd love to take a deeper dive, I have my online programs, Healing the Mind, A Journey to Wholeness, which is a holistic and integrative approach to mental health. It's a 21-day guided program. It's my flagship program that takes a deep dive into all things addiction, anxiety, depression, etc. We have Healing Your Core Archetypes, A Journey of Empowerment, which dives into the 7 key archetypes that are at the root of the healing journey, including the 4 survival archetypes and the saboteur. So this is awesome for diving into patterns of addiction, patterns of self-sabotage, or any way that we feel stuck, trapped, or not progressing on our healing journey. Healing the Mind, A Journey to Wholeness is also in book form. So if you go to Amazon, you can find that available for sale. And then finally, go to healing40.com. You can reach out to me if you're interested in some one-on-one coaching. I'd be happy to support you. I work with a lot of clients who struggle with addiction. It's one of my favorite things to work with because it's near and dear to my heart. It's something that I've worked through in my own healing process. So it's my way of giving back and finding meaning and purpose in my own healing journey. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I look forward to sharing more with you soon on a future podcast. Enjoy the rest of your week, the rest of your day. Bye-bye.